So we're going to go straight into the second session. The next group we're going to talk a bit about customer engagement. So I don't know if the panelists just want to come up. We've got Mark Porter, who's the head of customer operations at Oodle Finance. So Oodle Finance is obviously a motor finance provider. We've got Sarah Brown, who's the head of risk and compliance at Freeman, Gratton Holdings. Hey Sarah. Frank Sherlock, who's the VP of International at CallMiner, who are into speech and text and analytics. And we've got Simon Gregory, who's the sales director for Data on Demand, who look at data insights and provider for companies. Just wait for a second to shut the door. So welcome. So we see the people who didn't have like 3 cups of coffee before they started. You know I did because I saw you in Starbucks. Okay, fabulous. So let's get started, I suppose. So this session here, we're going to talk a bit about customer engagement. And we just heard before around what's happening from a cost of living point of view. And I think what do we need to do to engage customers in this new world? I mean, obviously we had the pandemic. Digital engagement became a big thing through the pandemic, but we've now got a cost of living crisis, and we just heard around reticence around, talking with people in collections or talking with people, if people are in financial difficulties, or we might actually see, people doing more credit seeking as well, right, through this. I mean, how do we need to start thinking about engaging customers, talking about some of these issues, and what should our approach be as an industry from a process and from a technology point of view? So I was going to start off, I suppose, just in terms of maybe Mark at the end there, just talking about, obviously you've got a customer operations role in terms of some of the you see, so both from a service point of view and from a collections point of view. And it'd be good to maybe just get your perspective, particularly in terms of the light of what we just talked about. Are they some of the things you're seeing in terms of like engagement, almost like pre-arrears in collections has become a much bigger volume piece than the actual collections piece?
Yeah, and I think to echo what the first panel members were saying, it feels like this is the calm before the storm, and we are seeing that customers are engaging with us pre-arrears, and that's almost the easier type of engagement, because these are the people who've recognised there's a challenge coming, want to sort it out, want to work with us, and we can help them to do that. I think that the big challenge that's always referenced is that proactive pre-delinquency approach. How do you get people to engage and recognise there's an issue? But also, I think from a collections point of view, I think there's a number of different layers to the whole point around engagements. And whilst we'll deep dive, I'm sure, and explore them through this discussion around getting the content of comms right, utilising different channels of communication. I know a lot of, and I'm an ops person, but a lot of operations areas at the moment are looking at resourcing levels. Have we got the right number of people? Are we accessible? And also, I think, learning some of the lessons from the COVID period. Referenced earlier the FCA's Borrowers in Financial Difficulties paper. It sort of highlights the fact that whilst we've come a long way in collections, we're probably not completely where we need to be. And there was an interesting paper, which I'm sure many people in the audience saw from Step Change, around mixed messaging and customer engagement a few weeks ago. And they were referencing stats like, I think, 38% of customers that they surveyed felt that the communication content from creditors was helpful. Well, there's a lot of people that didn't find it very helpful. Only 27.5% their survey said felt that creditors want to help them. And speaking as an ops person, we want to help customers. It's not only because we want to be a decent, ethical business, but it's also in our interest to help them get back on their feet. So there is a lot, I think, to think about with regards to engagement at the moment. But what we are seeing is I think, almost different cohorts of customers. There are some people following COVID who have almost got a bit of an expectation the government's going to jump in and rescue them and come up with some sort of solution here, because that's what happened during COVID. We are starting to see as well customers with lower resilience levels maxing out their credit cards. Food inflation is quite a challenge. And we're also seeing bread and butter collections, income expenditure assessments. It's quite difficult at the moment because of the inflationary pressure and the challenges. one of the findings, the things the FCA called out is don't just talk about their affordability position now, but look to the future. And it's quite difficult having that conversation with the customer about the future because there's a lot of unknowns. And just a quick sort of introductory point for me around the well-being, I think that resonates as well around looking after staff and making sure that they're given the support they need, not only because they're going through the same challenges, but I think the point around all of the regulatory changes, all of the expectations associated with doing operational collections, the role is very different now than it was in the past. And trying to support vulnerable customers, picking up indicators of vulnerability, etc. It's a difficult job being on the phones talking to people. It was difficult during COVID, and we're straight into a cost of living crisis. So it's making sure that we are supporting our staff to have these conversations.
Yeah, and I suppose, Sarah, I was going to come to you and just ask a little bit about customer engagement strategy, customer journey, and this kind of thing, and particularly from a retail finance point of view. I mean, what are some of the things that you're seeing, and is it changing as a result of cost of living, particularly in terms of, I suppose, people looking buying different things, or maybe looking in terms of like what they can afford versus not?
Yeah, so the firm I work for is a combined retailer and credit offer, and we often in firms like that tend to think about those two elements of the business separately. But actually the customer doesn't think about those two things separately. They don't logically separate in their mind the item they have bought with the credit and the credit itself. And so we shouldn't think of it separately either. And I think what's really interesting, as I was kind of reflecting on the way here this morning, we talk about customer engagement in a, I think sometimes a bit of a patronising way, because we talk about customer engagement in terms of something that we do to customers, not about what customers do to us. I think we will talk about operational solutions. How many people do we need? What systems do we need? Do we need to outsource anything? Do we need to offshore anything? Do we need to make a great new web chat facility? Do we need to put emails rather than phone numbers? All these things we talk about, but what we don't often talk about is, well, what are the customers telling us that they need us to do? We might set up all these fabulous models. We might introduce some brilliant new technology, but are customers actually using it? Are they using it for the purposes in which it is intended? And certainly one of the things that I've seen in a number of places that I've worked is that customers are really good at finding a way to get to the quickest and most helpful solution, even if that is not the person that you intended them to talk to about that thing. But they will understand, I phoned that number to talk about, actually, it was because I had a complaint. And I got through to the complaints team and they were super helpful. So next time I have a problem, even if it's not a complaint, I'm going to use that number again because that's where I got my solution. So I think we could be a lot more responsive to not just the kind of the operational expectations, metrics, measures, but what our customers actually doing.
And do you think that's changing if you just even look over the last 6 months? I mean, I'm just talking about expenditure, right? So I was reading last night around, I think it was food inflation, which was like 14%, I think it was in the last 6 months. It's 16% over the last year. I mean, that's big changes, and that's to date, not what's going to happen in the future. I mean, are people changing the way they want to engage now? I mean, how responsive do we have to be in terms of reflecting those changes?
I think it might have been Chris who was mentioning it earlier. There is still this, I don't know what the right word is, but I'll say shame around the concept of debt, particularly if you're getting to a situation that you have never personally experienced before. So we're also seeing those people who maybe have never struggled with financial difficulties before, and they are a different cohort of people that are needing to be engaged with in a different way. The customers who are, I call it long-term subprime customers, are used to managing every penny. It's what they've done for a long time. They might not enjoy it, but it is what they've done for a long time. And we are well established in terms of how we talk to them. The new cohort of customers that potentially are only in pre-arrears, they are much harder to engage with. And, certainly you'll see a lot of customers who would prefer not to speak to a person at all. And would prefer to have some kind of online interaction where perhaps they can set up their own payment proposal, without ever talking to anyone. They might complete an income and expenditure assessment and say, I can afford to pay X. That's great, but we know that customers are historically over-optimistic about their ability to repay in circumstances like this. And to your point, things are so fluid, the assessment they do today may not be valid tomorrow. So I think, where we do things like that, we should be using other data points that we have to validate what that customer has told us.
Yeah, Simon, I was going to come to you just a bit around sort of data. Obviously, you're in the data space, and how much of the value, how much of importance is around data and segmentation, and how much are you seeing that being used to, particularly almost like slice the portfolio in a different way to find some of these areas?
Yeah, well, I know our CEO's in the audience somewhere, so as a sales director of a data company, then yes, I'd say that new data is going to be important for firms. Yeah. I mean, Anna referenced the creep, that kind of section of society, which I think is something we'll need to keep using and may catch on. But what we're seeing from lenders and also people in the collection sector is exactly that. It's trying to identify how can we identify the people whose circumstances are changing very rapidly because of all the challenges we've got in society right now. There's a lot of data sources out there, and Andrea talked about all the great stuff that Experian and the other CRAs do. A lot of that data is after the fact. So I think the conversations that we're having a lot with lenders and also people in the collection space at the moment is, what can we identify to help them reach out to and support those consumers who are in financial difficulty for the first time, who are in collections for the first time as well. And some of those conversations are, saying, have we got a prime customer who's gone down an application route for subprime credit for the first time? Some of those type of indicators. And giving that information back to lenders allows them then to reach out with, again, coming back to Anna's points, not to go out to a consumer and say, we know you are vulnerable, but to include them in communication strategies that actually allow them to tell them what support is available and make them feel more comfortable about their situation.
And what are some of the trends you're seeing now? I mean, if you've got this sort of recency of data, what are some of the trends? Are you seeing some of the trends in terms of like changes fundamentally happening? So we might not be seeing it in arrears levels, but in terms of either credit seeking, we talked about a little bit before around changes in people applying for different types of credit. I mean, are you seeing some of that? Or?
Yeah, so one of the areas that we take our data from is applications for subprime lending. So we see the volumes that are coming through there, we see the types of individuals, we see the types of reasons that they're asking for that credit as well. And we're certainly, a couple of the key things we're seeing, one is an increase in new people who've never been looking for that type of subprime credit before, and also we're seeing increases in the loan purposes for things like bill payment, for debt repayment, etc. And that's maybe changing from more discretional spend in the past to being more urgent, clear signs of vulnerability.
Okay. Interesting. And so, Frank, I was going to do you next just around, particularly around some of the technology around engagement in terms of we sort of talked a little about how that's been changing. People wanted to proactively call people, proactively get in contact with people. I mean, are you seeing sort of changes in technology in terms of what customers are asking for?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk. We're very lucky in CallMiner that we deal with multiple customers across multiple segments in multiple lines of business. So when you think about customer engagement, you measure customer engagement by the experience that you deliver to the customer that delivers the best outcome for the business and the best outcome for the consumer. We did a study quite recently, actually, across 450 different organizations that we called the CX landscape, where we asked them about the state of customer experience. And some of the data points that we found, there's three big challenges that were generic across any line of business and any organization that were impediments to providing the best customer experience. Vulnerability was number one, the increasing levels of vulnerability, not just financial vulnerability, health vulnerability, and believe it or not, digital vulnerability is becoming more and more. There's a growing side of the population that doesn't have the means or the skills or the capabilities, perhaps, to engage digitally. During the pandemic and the work from home, there's lots of investment made in digital transformation. I think some of that's left people, vulnerable people, disenfranchised and unable to really engage with the organisations as they should be. Second one was employee engagement. There is an absolute link between outcomes and motivation, morale of the employees who are dealing in collections in particular, very difficult conversations. So that was the second point. And the third point, your CEO will be pleased to hear this, is data. The access to data. There's lots and lots of data, but the timely data that when you're engaging with a consumer or a debtor, that you've got access to that data to allow you to get to the right outcome as quickly, as efficiently as possible. And so they were the three areas, Chris, and I think, I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about how technology can help in those three areas, but I just thought I'd just let's say straight out the gate, when you think about customer engagement, think about those three areas, because those three areas will ultimately impact the experience you're able to deliver to the customer.
Do you think that almost like the digital revolution has almost like gone too far? I mean, I talk about like, have we reached peak digital? Provocatively, but because a lot of people are talking about like you've got to have a person involved now.
So I'll give you a personal opinion. Yes, I think that if you think we've been in the age for the last 5 years. We've been in the age of digital transformation, the rush to automated chatbots and lots of other web self-service and speech IVR, all these wonderful things to help the customer to self-serve, help the customer to engage with us. But ultimately, I think we're moving from the age of digital transformation to the age, what I would call, I'd call it the era of agent assistance. That we have to now, having provided these technologies, having living within the macroeconomic climate that we're in, that we've already spoken about, the increases in vulnerability, etc. The agents need better support. They're having difficult conversations. It's impacting motivation and morale. Whatever we can do from a tech perspective to help the agents, I think that's where the next, from my perspective, people may think that this is wrong, but I think the next level of the next era for the next few years is all going to be around agents. Yeah.
Sarah, you sort of smiled when I said it, in terms of it's kind of good to kind of get your kind of view on it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I touched on it briefly, I think, in my first comments, that we tend to think about customer engagement in a very operational way. So we will roll out a digital solution because it is operationally efficient to do so. But a customer doesn't fit neatly into one specific box, and their experience isn't always linear, it isn't always predictable. And I think particularly for customers who may have additional needs, and not necessarily solely in terms of, for example, financial vulnerability, but, for example, accessibility needs. The internet generally and technology has been a huge enabler for that cohort of customers. So I don't think my nephew minds me using him as an example, because I consistently do. But he has very severe cerebral palsy. He can't talk, but he can use a computer. So when the technology works and the facility is available to him, it is an amazing enabler for customer engagement. When he wants to do something that steps outside of the standard process in one way or another, or perhaps that system is down, or perhaps it's overloaded at that particular time, there is nowhere else for him to go, because there are so few people left in many organisations to actually have an accessible interaction an accessible personal interaction with the customer, that whole thing then falls down. And so I think the peak digital also runs the risk of really disenfranchising some of the people who've most benefited from the digital provision in the first place.
Yeah. So again, we're back to this complex picture rather than it being sort of binary. It's kind of like some people absolutely want digital because it means they don't have to talk about the debt and they want to do it digitally, but other people then want to get through to someone, right?
Yeah, and every customer has unique needs, and I think every firm also has unique needs. And the digital offering. So, I started my digital working career in eBay back in 2000 when nobody knew who eBay were, and our server was in the kitchen. Things have moved on, I think, quite a lot since then. But actually, the customer base hasn't moved on in the same way, and there will always be those customers who want the traditional interaction for every single touch point. But I think what we're really seeing now is those real moments of truth, and those are the points where customers will still want to have a personal conversation because it doesn't feel right to do anything else.
And so when you talk a bit about customer-centric journeys, I think is kind of what you're saying, is the thinking centred around the customer. What about just going back to what was raised in the previous discussion around branding for collections, and particularly in the cost of living crisis, how do we need to brand ourselves differently to try and get people to call in to get the support? I'm interested in, Simon or Mark, like some of your kind of views on that. It feels like that can be an issue in terms of perception of particular collections, or being in financial difficulties. But like, how do we need to think about ourselves, branding ourselves differently, almost like in a way to get to drive it?
We haven't been collections for many years, really, have we? We're supporting people.
Exactly.
We're a support function that wants to help them. I think you're right, and look, we're guilty of this. We at Oodle have a collections department. And so I would suspect that probably puts some customers off contacting us because it implies quite strongly we want to collect money. Well, we want to find a solution, and collecting money isn't always the right solution. So, I think we need to rebrand collections departments, but I think within our comms content, there's a lot more we can do around building that trust with the customer base, that we really genuinely want to help them and support them through a difficult period. And I think certainly in the motor finance space, we're talking here a lot about data, which is really important, it is, but we're dealing with a lot of emotions as well. So your point about how we brand ourselves and how we approach customers is really important, because a lot of customers are going through, this is an emotional journey for them, not just a financial issue.
But it's also a question around how do we make ourselves as departments, particularly pre-collections, approachable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right, it's a cultural point as well as identity, and it's about how do we build within our staff and our business a genuine understanding and belief that we want to help people, and that's in our commercial interest to do so. But how we present ourselves to our customers is really important. But that needs to be joined up from the messaging on IVRs and on websites and the training delivered to staff. It all needs to tie together. And I still think we all experience companies, not just within financial services, who've also got almost like identity problems, depending on what department you speak to or website you go onto. It's almost like you can sometimes be dealing with completely different businesses. Yeah. And I think that you still see, your point about talking to complaints, etc., I think a lot of companies are still have the challenge of maybe some siloed thinking. And I think that we've come a long way as an industry on being joined up in the way we approach customers, but it feels like there's still a little bit more we can do.
Yeah. I think to add on that as well, there's coming back to the bit we were talking about before around the different types of consumer that debt collection businesses might be seeing now, the best engagement is engagement that's sustainable. And if you've got customers who are in consistent debt, you want to make sure that they know they can get a resolution with you, and they know they can contact you through the same channels. But coming back to the point we made about the new people coming into there, it needs to be a much kind of softer approach, a much more informative approach, I think, because it'll be people who've never been in those circumstances before. I know lots of people in the room will be well aware of all the types of brand, the types of businesses that may contact people from a collections perspective. But if you've never been in that situation before, you're not going to be used to that. And trying to soften that approach, I think, a little bit is something we've seen from some of our clients as well.
Yeah, it's almost like dedicated journeys for new in collections or never been in collections.
Yeah, which comes back to the segmentation point again of understanding the customer before you push them down a certain contact channel.
Just on customer conversations, there's a good question here around how can you make customer conversations more real, especially when firms rely on email, SMS, web chat as volumes increase. So digital is being used to sort of like help flex volumes, because we know in the background there's the other question around hiring people, right? And hiring people is not as easy as it has been, and that's there. So we're using digital to do that. But like, how do we use digital to sort of help augment capacity, but then also try and make sure it's real as well? I mean, Frank, do you want to? It's kind of you're probably.
I guess yeah. I mean, in terms of making sure it's real. I mean, you'll have email, you'll have web chat, you'll have chat bots, you'll have audio, you'll have lots of these different communications mechanisms, and it's really important to be able to, I think, to understand at scale what is working and what isn't working. Why are customers dropping out of the chat bot to go to to go to an agent? What sort of drivers are leading to that? Is it a problem with the chatbot and the menu structures? Which customers are on an email and getting automated replies rather than that just make them ring the contact center. So what we try and do for our customers at scale is to allow them to actually understand and join up these different channels and say, what is working in one that isn't working in another, and being able to filter that data across multiple different touch points and being able to really try and get a more complete view of what that communication strategy should be. So my comment, Chris, is join them together, analyze them, and then do something with the analysis, because if you don't do something with the analysis, it's just data.
Yeah. I'm interested in Mark and Sarah, your kind of views as well.
Yeah, I think joining up is incredibly important. So as a head of risk and compliance, I'm often called upon to sign off a particular piece of content. And even that process in and of itself isn't joined up. So I'll be presented with an email, can you approve this? And I'm like, well, what does the customer see before that email? What do they see after that email? What do they see at the same time? And it comes back to your point too on the siloed working. So I don't think our ways of working necessarily always facilitate that joining up. I also think the tone of voice and the choice of words is incredibly important. And I'm on a bit of a personal crusade about this, really, because I feel like a way to get the tone of voice and the choice of words right is to have diversity of thought in your organisation and the people who are helping you pull that content together. And what is incredibly powerful is if some of those people you're calling upon to help produce that content have a similar lived experience to the customers that they are going to be talking to. I think that's incredibly valuable and can help you empathise and understand in a way that you can't necessarily always do. And I've heard people here on this panel and the last panel talk about discretionary expenditure, which I find quite uncomfortable as a term, because it implies that we should be making some kind of value or moral judgment on what people are spending their money on. And I think there's been a historical demonisation in the press and sometimes in the financial services industry for the working class man or woman. You often see it's all very well that they've got the benefits, but they've also got a widescreen TV and they smoke cigarettes. And I think there's an underlying subtext to that still that I'm not entirely comfortable with. And I think we do need to be really careful, therefore, about the terminology that we use.
So it's quite interesting that you're talking about almost like this whole idea almost like around behavioural economics, I suppose, in terms of or the nudge program in terms of communications, and having an even more diverse set of communications to get people engaged. I mean, Simon's going to come back just on the data point in terms of using data to kind of help us do that, particularly in the pre-arrears space. I mean, is that kind of data easy to get? Is that being thought about, or?
I think one of the important things is just making sure that you, first of all, use the data you already have. So there's a lot of information. I'm sitting here as part of a data business. We're all about encouraging people to take new data into the processes where it's appropriate. But one of the first things is just understanding the wealth of data you actually get from from existing customers you're engaging with. So if you've dealt with them before, do you know the preferred contact channel they like to use? Is that type of data that you're storing and reusing to get the best engagement from them when you do so again? But then for new customers who you haven't dealt with before, if you can't actually make contact with them in the first place, then you're going to have a problem. So I think it's reaching out and trying to understand where you can get current contact channel information from, but also being able to understand the situations that the customer's in at the time to provide the best level of support for them.
Yeah. I mean, we always think of engagement almost like we talk to people when we need to, we engage people when we need to talk to them. Is kind of what, Sarah, you were saying. I mean, how proactive do you think we need to be? And maybe I'll go back to you, Mark, in terms of like that proactive reach out to do it. And does digital or technology give us an ability to just be much more engaged? And does that help us be much more supportive?
Yeah, I think it does. I think you know, if I reflect on our product type, we lend somebody the money to go and purchase a vehicle. It's not a type of product where they really want to engage that often with us until it gets towards the end of their agreement maybe, or they want to settle, or they're in financial difficulties. So I've seen various lenders try that sort of keeping in touch with customers, checking in with them approach. But I think for me the key thing is, you know, on the data point, making sure that you keep your customer contact details updated so that when there does come a point where you need to reach out to your customers, the data that you captured at time of lending, maybe a number of years earlier, may not be up to date. So I think that's the first hurdle, good contact detail records, and things like data cleanse can help in that front. I think the whole comms content piece is really interesting, and I think there's a lot of challenge, certainly from the regulator, around tailored communications. And I think that I still get surprised when I see lenders that have risk segmentation, and maybe split into, you know, low, medium, high. But really all that seems to do is link to intensity of content, contact, where rather than and your point around, really important to get the way we present information, build that trust, talk in simple language. And the whole point, which others have mentioned around sort of this legal and compliance type language which creeps into our space, really off-putting for customers. But I find, you know, this is where I always feel as a little bit as an ops person a bit no-win, because you've got people like, for example, Step Change talking about customers are embarrassed, they're scared, they're overwhelmed. So avoid things like telling them about the consequences, don't bang on about their credit file, etc., because it shuts down engagement. But then you've got some regulatory expectations around making sure the customer does understand the consequences, can make an informed decision. So it does feel like, and the CCA point made in the first session as well, we've got some very old legislation there creating comms, which is not encouraging engagement. So it does feel like, as an industry, we've got to come up with a view as to what tailored communication means in practice, because a collections function has to get that balance between scaling up but also being able to try and tailor their approach to the individual customer's needs.
But I mean, when you talk about like different, you mentioned before around different departments, almost like being different companies, right? I mean, is almost like that pre-arrears, and that's just called in-service communicate. Is that really the opportunity to like get the little engagement going now, so then when it gets to collections again? I mean, do we really make enough of that? I mean, is that something that the collections teams need to be much more involved in?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I mean, when we're talking about pre-arrears, and there's, of course, the reactive and the proactive approach, I think when we get a customer that rings in, the call will come through, of course, our customer services area. There's indicators of financial issues. The collections team will then have that reactive conversation to find a solution, and it's the same sort of options, pre-arrears, that are available to customers when they fall into arrears. The bit, being really candid, I think we haven't pinned down yet, and I don't think many in the industry have got it right, is the whole proactive approach. I think, like mentioned earlier, when you write out to customers, because there's indicators they may be in financial difficulties, high credit card utilisation rates, defaulted elsewhere, etc., it just doesn't seem to work in practice and encourage engagement. What customers really want pre-arrears is a non-judgmental sort of approach, signposting. But I think one of the things the FCA have been highlighting through the DSEO letter in June, but also the Borrowers in Financial Difficulties findings, is don't just signpost debt advice, but talk about the benefits of that debt advice. So there's a little bit of a sales approach and encouraging people to go and get this holistic free debt advice, which helps us as lenders, helps the customers. But it's still sad, I think, that so few people go and get that advice and go and get that help. And that's what we need to face into the cost of living crisis, get more people getting that holistic debt advice.
I think what was interesting what you're saying, but also what you were saying, Sarah, is like people are very engaged in what they bought, they're very engaged in their car, right? Is that an opportunity to then sort of start to put some of those messages in? But for me, it's always felt like we've always like waited a little bit too late. I mean, do we need to think about it differently now in this environment?
We do, although I wouldn't necessarily say I've got a brilliant answer because I haven't.
It's hard.
But I think, you know, the lessons learned, I think, from the persistent debt communications are really powerful here. So, you know, by definition, the persistent debt requirements are to some degree proactive to stop customers getting to that state. And what we found when communicating with persistent debt customers and sending them those letters at the different touch points was, you know, customers would feel like we were telling them off, but actually, you know, they'd always paid exactly as much as we had ever asked them to pay. And they'd always acted in accordance with their agreement. And it was very hard for them to understand, why are you telling me about this? You know, are you telling me I need to pay more than you asked me for? But why? And that was really difficult, you know, to get the right tone of voice in those communications. And that was something with very specific, structured metrics around it. This is much less specific. So I think even harder to get that engagement. Yeah.
I mean, Simon, I was going to ask you a little bit about, I suppose, data to do the data engagement, the customer engagement side of things. I mean, a lot of the data we've tended to gather has really been around payments or, you know, and it's really driven by the financial bottom line. I mean, do we gather enough data around how to engage people? You mentioned before around previous contact preference or those kind of things. I mean, is there other data out there we can use to sort of augment our database to do some of the things we're talking about elsewhere, but in a different way than we typically think about things, which is more sort of like financial bottom line based?
Yeah, I mean, part of that, coming back to the point we made before, is that the FCA haven't missed the fact that historically lenders haven't really done much work on their existing customers after the point with which they complete the lending, until they actually reach out, and there has to be some kind of reactive point in time when the customer comes back to them and says, I've missed a payment or I've got some kind of challenge. So I think from that side of things with Consumer Duty, we've seen the FCA very clearly set it out that that is no longer acceptable, and there does need to be proactive steps continuously by lenders for consumers. And on the data point then, I think we've talked a lot about financial data, but there's also lots of life events, etc., and there's data available on consumers from that side of things. So, for example, if somebody has, you know, recently lost their job, recently changed from a mortgage residential position to renting, or if somebody has recently been divorced or widowed. Again, there's lots of those data points which can be captured, which can help build up a picture of a consumer to be proactive, or at the very least be ready and make sure agents, etc., are more informed at the point that the consumer actually does make contact with you.
Yeah, Frank, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is you have a lot of data already. There's a lot of data and insight that will help you improve customer engagement that's locked within. You know, where we deal is when organisations are having conversations with the consumers. There's lots of data that's locked in those conversations that will enable you to improve end to end. So one of the things that maybe a couple of examples. One of the things that you know, we see with our customers, they do surveys. They may do, you know, NPS surveys or some other measurement of whether that was a good, bad, or indifferent call. The survey may have some verbatim comments. There may be, you know, 148 words of verbatim comments or 1 minute of verbatim comments. Survey response rates are, well 8%, 10%, maybe less. When you can combine, though, that solicited data with the unsolicited data that already exists within these conversations, you're able to understand, I think, a bit more about the DNA of the calls that lead to poor outcomes or low levels of satisfaction, and the calls that lead to great outcomes and great levels of satisfaction. When you're able to see all that at scale, because I would argue you can't do that much with what you get from the surveys until you combine it with the unsolicited data that exists within the conversations. So that would be my view, Chris, is you have the data, it's just about using it.
Yeah, and I suppose the more bits of information you get, the more it sort of multiplies out as well. There's an interesting question here around value exchange. As an industry, do we need to improve the value exchange for customers to engage with their creditors? So he talks about income maximisation, those kind of things. I mean, how do we... So we talk about value exchange a lot in terms of open banking. Do we need to talk about value exchange in terms of their customers giving us more information for engagement?
I think maybe, open banking is a very good example of that. One thing I think we were talking about when we were doing some prep beforehand is the types of engagement that, particularly from a collection sector, businesses may want to adopt. One of the things we've seen is people going out with quite soft approaches in the first instance, which is just introducing themselves as the collections business, not actually asking for any direct action from the consumer at that point, but just trying to gauge from them, we're going to reach out to you again, we want to engage with you. Can you give us a little bit of insight on what the best channel to engage with you is? And just asking for that, small pieces at a time, and making them understand that value exchange of, if you provide that information to us, we'll get in touch with you on the channel that you prefer. And it's kind of putting a bit more power back into consumers' hands.
Yeah. I mean, Sarah or Mark, what's your kind of view, particularly as it links back to, I suppose, understanding and getting people more engaged earlier on, and I suppose that branding issue as well. And is actually a value exchange kind of thinking we now have to apply across the rest of the customer journey?
Yeah, I mean, it links back to the consistency point we were talking about earlier as well, right? That if you are proposing some kind of value exchange, that it should ideally be consistent across all the customers' interactions, regardless of what particular team in the firm that they're talking to. I also think there's a bit of a danger that firms try and do too much. And I know you mentioned income maximisation, for example, and I think there's a really fine line between offering a compelling and helpful and insightful collections journey and starting to move, probably unintentionally, into debt advice. And no, that's not what the collections teams are for. And I agree, the FCA is wanting us to more actively signpost rather than just stick it on the back of a letter. But what are we really asking our colleagues and our content to do? Is it treading into the debt advice space, or is it actually really being really clear on where our obligations stop? Because if we were to go inadvertently into that space and then give poor or incorrect advice or support, the consequences would be material for the firm and the customer.
But that's where I think as well partnerships come into play. Not to go into a sales spiel for them, but one of the things we did at Motor Novo as a trial on income maximisation front was we worked with a social enterprise called Income Max. And you've probably seen like Lee Healy, who runs it on Martin Lewis show, etc., giving benefits advice. And what was really good with them, and we did it specifically for the most vulnerable customers where you could signpost, but because of their personal circumstances, they didn't have the ability to go and apply for benefits or to go on to the benefits calculator website, etc., etc. So what Income Max did was, with the customer's consent, they would work with the customer, they would help them apply for benefits, get them this extra money. There was nothing to do with the debt side of it. It was all about simply helping maximise their income. We got really good feedback from those customers, and for us it helped us evidence to people like the regulator that we were genuinely trying to help the most vulnerable customers. And I think this is my point about tailoring your approach. If you know a customer's extremely vulnerable, telling them we're getting debt advice or going and applying for benefits is fantastic. You can tell them how good it is and how it will help them, but if they haven't got the ability to do it, you're not really helping them. So I do think as well, on your point about giving advice, we absolutely don't want to cross into giving advice. And I think sometimes we get a little bit close to that in the collection space. But we can also build those relationships with the debt advice sector. So it becomes a genuine partnership. And I also think that changes the way customers see creditors, because all of these different key stakeholders working together to try and deliver the right outcome for customers. Now, I say all of that knowing that in practice, it's I could bring
harder, yeah.
not as easy, but creditors mustn't try and approach this in isolation.
And what's your view, I suppose, there's another question there around, so I suppose, things like signposting debt advice, and there's integration that's built in, income maximisation we want, with benefits advice, there's other ones around, I suppose, I&E, but then also in terms of like debt advice as well, and referring out to debt advice. And these, with APIs, we can start to sort of build much more integrated processes within a creditor's portal, as an example. I mean, do you think that's a way forward to add utility to the process in terms of the journey?
It is, but it's not an infinite pool of resource that we are signposting customers to. So we could build fantastic systems to channel huge numbers of customers through to debt advice, knowing that it is a very stressed sector already. So I'm not sure that it would be as effective as we hope. We'd just potentially be pushing a bottleneck for just a bit further down the line.
So you're saying you've got to think about the process design as much as just here's another whizzy thing to put in.
Well, it's the outcome, right? Because we might say, well, the outcome is that we have actively signposted. That's not really the outcome, is it? The outcome should be, has the customer got the advice that they needed? And where there are circumstances which means it might be difficult for them to receive the advice, it's an incomplete picture.
That's the big question, isn't it? Are the debt advice sector geared up for what's coming? They're not, are they really?
Yeah. So just in terms of volumes, I'll talk about, and maybe Frank, this is a question for you, in terms of like how much can technology help us with potentially increasing volumes? So it sounds like we're not seeing that yet. We all know it. We all think it's coming through, and we're getting ready for it, both in early stage collections, but also in debt advice sector as well. At some point, it's going to start to filter through. How much do we need to invest more in technology to really help us with that?
I think to go back to my earlier point, it's where are you going to invest that technology? Are you going to invest the technology in digital transformation, or are you going to invest the technology? The colleagues, associates, agents, they have a difficult job. We had on the last session, there's a storm coming. We're not quite sure how long the storm's going to last for and what gale force wind we're going to have, but things are going to get more difficult. I think that my advice would definitely be to look at technology from a point of how it's going to help the agent to feel better about the job they do by delivering better outcomes for the customers. That's where I would point in technology. I wouldn't personally be looking at channel technology, about omni-channel, and I personally think that the next, as I said earlier, the next space, it's all about agent assistance, and that's where I would focus.
And I suppose just on agent assist, and I suppose like call recording technology, but also if we look at blend that with customer outcomes as well, how much do you think that's going to come back, even from a regulatory point of view, in terms of like monitoring what's being done, because it's we're pushing this more stuff through technology, in terms of actually understanding whether these outcomes are really the outcomes that should be are right for the customer, particularly if you're looking at things like consumer duty into the future.
Yeah, I mean that is a difficult question to say. For me to say, hand on heart, it's going to deliver perfect outcomes. It's going to make the regulator really happy. But if you're able, but with technology, not just to sort of, I don't know, spot keywords like vulnerability or bereavement, but assist in the workflow that's in front of the agent. Use APIs to pop up onto the agent, what the next step should be. And guide them through the call using the technology that's available today, using the data that's available today, and joining that up. That's and I think that any regulator, I would think, if you're taking a holistic view, i.e. you're looking across everything, all of your customer interactions, you're looking across all of your agents, all of your teams, all of your journey points. You've got consistent and objective measures in place using tech to measure whether or not you're fulfilling your regulatory obligations, or what regulator wouldn't like that, I would argue.
And I suppose just reflections, some of the conversations I've had elsewhere is, as much as we can use the technology to monitor what's going on, the regulator can also use the technology to monitor what we do as well, right? Which is also, it's not a scary thought, but I suppose it can be a concern, right? In terms of like reviewing everything. I mean, Sarah, I know that's consumer duty is your kind of thing. I mean, what are the implications of that? I mean, because it is both hands.
It is, and I think, combined with the general requirements that are really prominent in consumer duty, the role of firms where it is incumbent on them to monitor and test those outcomes, we've also got the FCA explicitly and repeatedly saying we are becoming a more data-driven regulator. And yes, some of that data will be around customer outcomes. They might request other types of data too. And the more speedily and accurately firms can respond to those data requests, the better position they will be. And I think, the thing I've observed from the data requests from the FCA that I've seen over the last couple of years is they are trying very hard when they ask their questions to cover a broad church. The definitions or the questions they use can't possibly align to every single firm that they are asking those questions of. So it then makes firms have a bit of a kind of head-scratch moment whether, what do we think the FCA means by this? Or what data can we use to prove this? And so, the more secure you are in your own data points, then the easier you will find it to respond to those. But I do think, as you say, it is to some degree also a double-edged sword. People tended to submit their Gabriel/reg data returns every 6 months or so and type it in and hit send and then potentially forget about it for the next 6 months till they have to do it again. But the FCA is also explicitly calling out they are looking at even that information. So it's not just about customer outcomes when it comes to data. It's about much more of a macro view as well.
Yeah. And how structured do you think firms typically are in terms of like getting their processes ready? I mean, because it's a bit of a brave new world in some ways of like being able to press a button and all the data comes out. That's not the reality that I've normally experienced. In reality, it's usually lots of us with spreadsheets in the background. But
is it not, Chris?
No. Maybe it should be, Frank.
The magic button.
Yeah.
That would be amazing if we had one of those.
Yeah. I mean, so how much work? I mean, is that a priority we've got to put in place? And maybe Simon and Frank just talk through that in terms of like, do we need to look at our processes and look how we store our data and interact and this whole thing around transparency of data as it leads to customer engagement?
Yeah, I think part of that comes back to what Sarah was just talking about there around the fact the regulator has never been and will probably never be prescriptive about what they suggest a good outcome is going to be. So I think one of the first things that particularly lenders need to do is decide themselves and document what they think a good outcome is going to be. And a starting point, if you've got that starting point as an organisation and you've recorded that, it's then about thinking, okay, what data do I need to support being able to evidence that we've provided that good outcome that we've decided is going to be a good outcome for our customers. And I think, as I said, that's because of the fact that even though consumer duty is probably a little bit more prescriptive than some of the regulation we've had before, it still leaves a lot of ambiguity. And if you're going to be able to stand up and defend your position for what a successful outcome is, you need to very clearly define what that is and make sure you're capturing relevant data for it.
Yeah.
And I think particularly with firms that will have a fairly long-standing legacy tech stack, that's not as easy as it sounds, speaking from personal experience. And not only is it not as easy as it sounds to extract the data, it's also then not easy to present it in a palatable and comprehensible way to the regulator once you've got it. Because if you can't portray yourself well, it's going to be very difficult for the regulator to use that data, and they will draw their own conclusions from that.
And the tech stack, which is a reality, right, for a lot of us. I mean, like, how much does that constrain us creating new customer journeys? I mean, because it seems like that's paramount now. And, you know, how do we become more flexible around that? And what's the priority we need to put around flexibility? Do we need help sort of pushing up the agenda with, you know, boards and, you know, C-suite?
I think, obviously, you know, cloud technology, you know, even in the last 5 years, I've seen more and more of our client base move what would have, you know, mission critical systems, you know, the ability to get dial tone and make calls, yeah, receive calls, moving that stuff to the cloud. So I think the cloud helps to you may not agree here, but helps, I think, reduce the cost and the time involved in getting access to the tech stack to help organizations, you know, do a better job with the technology. So I would say cloud, and then I think that for the techies in the audience, you know, the applications programming interfaces and open APIs, allowing machines to talk to each other in a much more structured, much quicker and productive way than in the past. I think they're the two areas that I think will help with the technology conundrum. You know, undoubtedly, there are some old tech stacks out there that you know, some of the new thoughts, ideas in the tech world won't fit.
Okay. And we didn't talk much about channels, but I suppose that we're almost at time, and I'm happy if anyone wants to put their hand up and ask a question live. I'm happy to do that now. I know we're getting them on Slido, so thanks for that. But before we finish, I suppose maybe just the panel just quickly go through around. You know, we talk a bit about contact channels. Can you see any new contact channels come up? Maybe it's not about contact channels, but I mean, what do we need to focus on customer engagement in the foreseeable future, as in now in the next 3 months, given all this change is kind of going on? I mean, Mark, maybe kick off on that.
I'd probably echo what the regulator said, I think, in their borrowing financial difficulties paper. It feels a little bit like it's a reminder to get back to basics, understand the reason for arrears, the true reason, and make sure you're picking up any indicators of vulnerability, and making sure your staff are trained and are competent to have those right conversations, because all the tech in the world and contact strategies, you still need your collectors to have a good quality conversation, and making sure we're assessing income and outgoings so we can evidence that we've delivered the right outcome for the customer. Yeah. So back to basics.
Yeah. And do you think I'm just as you're talking now, I'm thinking about focus, right? In terms of like all this other distractions are going on, it's also around sort of how do we focus on that as well to a certain extent, which could be a challenge for us sometimes, but it's something that's quite important, no doubt.
And that's with, like you mentioned, consumer duty and other things that are going on at the moment. It feels that facing into the cost of living crisis, we need to help our operational teams really get back to basics, clear the decks, and focus on helping customers.
Yeah.
Challenge.
We need to listen. We need to listen to our customers, we need to listen to our colleagues, and then we need to do something with what we're hearing.
Yeah. Frank?
I sound like a stuck record, but focus on employee engagement. You know, I think that is where the winners and losers will be decided about who's put the right amount of resource, effort, training and technology into their employees. So that's where I would be spending my money.
And Simon, what's your kind of view in terms of future of collections, or, you know, customer engagement and credit as well? But, you know, how do we think about how we engage customers? What do you think the future kind of holds?
Yeah, I certainly don't think there's any necessity for kind of looking at new contact channels, because there's a lot of different channels out there through Omni chats, chatbots, you know, email, SMS, phone call, etc. There's plenty of options. So I think it's about just making sure that you do offer flexibility to your customers when you're trying to engage with them, but also make sure all of those channels work, are as straightforward as possible, as simplistic as possible. Just give flexibility to customers, I think.
It sounds like a little bit of also like looking through the data to make sure they're being used and that they're being used effectively, and like customers actually want to use them as well.
And obviously my last word will be on data. So yes, new alternative data is always going to help.
So I think we're pretty much at time now. So I want to thank the panel for running through that. I mean, obviously, if you don't engage with customers, you don't find out, you know, what their needs are. So it's critically important that we do with the cost of living crisis. So Mark, Sarah, Frank, and Simon, thank you very much, and really appreciate you making time for the panel. So.